It's good. I'm going to move back and sit down in a moment when I start playing, but I'd just like to welcome so many people from all over the world, as far as I can see. And I don't know if any of you attended the one I did for Oregon a few months ago, but if you did, I may be saying the same things again, but there are some different examples as well, so hopefully you might learn something new overall. We'll be looking through all these 9 examples, 9 pieces I've chosen to look at, very small bits of them, as you will see from the extracts. Mainly 1 extract per piece, but some with 2. And I'll be playing different sizes of viol, so I'm going to change viol size a few times during the next hour and a bit, just to give variety, and because in some cases I'm going to play the part that would have had that particular thing, rather than play, say, a treble when it's actually a bass that starts the piece, as the first piece will be in a moment. I won't talk very much about fingering, because it would depend what size of viol you're on, which part you're on, whether that's applicable, but I will say a few things about fingering. Mainly I'll be talking about bowing, and for each piece, you'll know this if you read the PDF, the README PDF, I'm going to pick out a particular aspect of bowing that appears in that extract that needs thinking about in various ways. You can assume that if you were playing with your friends, which hopefully we'll be doing soon after this workshop, so you can apply all the things I've said, most of the parts will have something very similar to what we're looking at, although obviously the notes won't be the same. Some of the string crossings will be different for that. So we'll start with a 3-part music. I'm also going to just do a very brief overview of what Gibbons wrote for instruments as we go along. So I'm going to pick up my bass ready for the first example. The 3-part pieces are probably some of the best known of Gibbons music, because not everybody gets a chance to play 6-part very often, although they're very popular pieces. 3-part is a really good thing to have. And they appear in several sources. And those of you that were at the recent Gamba Society live meeting we had in Oxford quite recently, you will remember probably that quite a lot of the manuscripts we looked at in Christchurch were 3-part Gibbons in different versions. And there are several sources. So it's quite a well-documented group of pieces. 9 fantasias in the main collection. The first 4 for treble, tenor and bass, and the last 5 for 2 trebles and bass. And the style of those is really quite different, and later in style, you might say, with more sections, a bit of triple time, a bit more dancey in places. But the first 4 are very much sort of classical fantasia type of style. And that's what we're going to start with. The first fantasy in 3 parts, the bass part, which actually starts the piece off. And it's quite a simple theme. So we're looking at exercise 1A just for now. Hopefully you're all at 4:15. And I think we should all just play that first line together once. And then I'll say a few things about what I think. But I'm going to count in minims. I hope all the Americans have practiced their English terminology for crotchets, minims, and so on. So I'm going to count in minims. I'm going to give you 3, 4, and then we'll start on the first beat. And we're just going to play the first line of music that you've got there. 3 and 4 and. It's one of the best known themes, and I would think that I've probably heard it played 1,000 different ways. Not always very nice, I have to say. But so if we just start thinking about the very first part, we've got 3 crotchets on a repeated note, and then rising up to the F. But I have to say, I shouldn't suggest this perhaps at this stage, but the typical thing is to give too much stress either on all the crotchets. Immediately it sounds really ploddy, or sometimes just on the minim beats, because if you want to count minims, and a lot of people say you should always be counting minims in this sort of music, you get this. And that sounds just as bad. Basically, too many beats, we don't want to hear any beats. So the first thing I would say is that we need to increase the size of bow on each of those consecutive crotchets until we've reached the F. So I'll just demonstrate one. So I'm starting maybe a quarter of the way down the bow, something like that. Certainly not starting in the middle, because if I start in the middle, I'm going to be way down the bad end of the bow for most of the time. So somewhere around here, possibly nearer the tip, but if I start too near the tip, I can't increase the bow length because I'll run off the end. So it's something to bear in mind when you're going to increase the bow length, not to start at the very tip, but a little way down, so you've got room to expand in both directions, forwards and backwards. I'm just going to play those first 5 notes with everybody, starting about a quarter of the way down, starting on a forward bow, and increasing the bow size towards the F. 3 and 4 and easy if you remember, but a lot of people are in the habit of doing the same length of bow most of their time because it's what feels natural to each person, which may be for some people too much bow or not enough. If you're feeling unconfident, you get this with that stopping sound. So it's quite a free sound we need. It's not a sort of terribly sad slow piece. But the next thing is that after the F, it's a falling third, a minor third, we need that to be much, much weaker on the D. So we get this. And the amount of bow I'm using on that lower D is probably a 1/6 or less from what I used on the F. Quite a big difference. And another thing to consider is whether or not that theme crosses a string or could cross a string. And it will be different in every part, but every single one of the parts, all 3 of them, sometimes have this where you could cross the string, like we have on the bass. Some people would say, well, why not play it here? Much smoother. I would say a much less interesting sound. It's a nice line, perhaps, but you don't get the minor third effect that you get of string crossing. So for preference, I would string cross whenever possible on a falling third or a rising third. Any interval, harmonically interesting, ideally would go across strings. Of course, it's not possible all the time. In this case, all of the parts, if you looked at the actual thing, you'll find that all of the parts get all the options, that is all 2 of the options, crossing the string or not crossing the string. If you start on your open D, which the tenors have for today, on that open D, on their open string, there's no way that's going to cross. Tenors will be at that pitch, but they'll be doing it on an open string. So it doesn't apply in every case, but I would say that it's quite an important factor for nice phrasing to use the string crossing as a positive advantage, rather than just think, oh, well, it sounds smoother on one string. It may sound smoother, but it may sound less interesting and less good quality. Going on, let's do that all together, and let's go as far as the end of the 2nd bar on the dotted minim. After that, what I did, and it's not essential, but I prefer it, is I did a tuck going on an extra forward bow on the end of the bar. After the dotted D, I went forwards again, because I want to have the dotted minim here on a back bow, mainly because I've now got a run of quavers, etc. But even if I didn't have the run of quavers, the dotted minim going backwards has a lovely quality of falling, like you get in Lacrimé, Dowland's Lacrimé pattern. A back bow has a graceful, inviting feeling. It's good for the beginning of a falling phrase because it just gives the right atmosphere for a downward phrase. So you needn't do that tuck if you prefer not to, but then if you don't, all your quavers will be going the wrong way. The direction of bow is less important than a lot of other things, but that's what I would choose to do here. So let's just do that all together, the entire line. Just to remind you, we're increasing the bow size, falling away to the falling third, which is the D after the high F, then carrying on up to the dotted note in the second bar, and then probably doing an extra forward bow and then back bow on bar 3 in order to be in a good place for the quavers. Can we just do that whole line together, that same speed as we did? 3 and 4 and. And one more tiny thing for fingering for the end of that phrase, whatever size of instrument you're on, if you've got an octave lead, you need to hold the finger on the top note. Or if it's an open string, you don't have to worry. But if it's an open string, you've probably got an extra string to cross. You've probably got 4 strings to cross instead of 3, which makes the crossing a little bit harder. We'll leave that one. I'm not quite sure how the time will go, but I want to make sure we get through a bit of everything. So we'll go on to 1B, which is very straightforward looking. The main thing about 1B, which is later on in this same piece, is that that rhythm that comes here in the bass part, it reverses. That is, the bow reverses, because you've got dotted minim in either direction, 2 quavers, whichever way they come. I would definitely not want to do a tuck in after one of those dotted notes, because it's going to break the sound. It's going to make a gap. So you could say it doesn't matter which way you start, because it's going to alternate. But when you get to the top in this particular bass part, if you end up on that top D, a lot of people would then think, well, I'd rather be on the other bow, and so they do a tuck here. And to me, that ruins the top of that phrase, because it makes a hole just where we don't want a hole. So when you have something after the sequence, I would say you need to count back from that point where it might matter which way you end up. If you've got that sequence going on and then you have a rest, it wouldn't matter, because it wouldn't affect anything else. So I'm suggesting for this that you start on a back bow on the bottom G, first note. You keep going, you don't do any corrections at all, and you should come out with a forward bow on the top note. And for that top note, to have a nice line going down when you've got dotted minim, crotchet, and so on, you need to be right near the tip, because if you're not, you'll be trying to get enough bow on those crotchets for the next dotted minims, and they will get accented. So basically it's one crescendo up to the top D, and then it's a very smooth line going down, not allowing the crotchets to stick out, but working your way down the bow. As long as you started at the tip, you should be okay. Can we try that all together? I'm going to count minims again, and you're going to come in after 1 on a back bow on that low G. Same speed as we did the other bit. 1, 2, and 3. It's a really nice feeling. I mean, you just should feel that your bow has been driving along at whatever speed it might be, 10 miles an hour, a constant bow speed, which doesn't allow anything to stick out suddenly, because there are no sudden movements of the bow in any direction. Overall, it's probably a crescendo, so overall, each of those groups might expand in length. So the bow is going to get longer as you go through, but still in the right proportion for the dotted minim and the 2 quavers. Let's just do that once more. It's a fairly straightforward one. And try and feel that you're making sort of large-ish gestures on the white notes and much smaller movements on the black notes, so that nothing gets frantic or jumps out. Try that once more, and let's make a crescendo to the top note if possible. So let's start quite softly, not too much bow to start with. Did I count wrong last time? I can't remember. 3 and 4. No, sorry, I did. 1, 2, and 3. Sorry. one more thing at the very end, we've got a falling fifth, which you get in all bass parts all the time, a lot. And if you don't keep a finger, if there is a finger on the note before the end, you will get a gaping hole before that note. If it's an open string, no finger to hold, but you've got to cross 2 strings, which is, it's a nicer sound, but it's harder to get a good crossing. I did a 4th finger, so I can get a legato onto that note. And that would apply absolutely everywhere, all over the place. Particularly useful for bass players to make sure that whenever you have a cadence, you don't take the finger off the note before the end, whether you're going up or down. Let's move on. Fantasia number 4. So this is extract number 2, still the bass part. And Gibbons is full of patterns, which I'm sure you all know, and you'll spot them straight away. But he's particularly fond of these scales, cascading scales, either going down like these are, or up, which we're going to see a bit later on in exercise 7. And they nearly always have these downward movements or upward ones followed by a leap, and then they go down again and they're followed by a leap. As you can see here very clearly, a lot of very big leaps during the quavers. And it should sound like someone else coming in, not like one person joining across that 7th or whatever it is. But it should sound like starting wherever you are, then an alto comes in, then a soprano, whatever it is. You have to make it sound as if it's 2-part writing in your own part, and the others are also doing that, so that sounds more like 6 vowels than 3 if everyone does it really well. So just bowing wise pretty straightforward. We want to have the quaver runs going what I'd call the right way round. That is, you'd want, if you've got 4 quavers in a group, I'd want forward on the first one of 4. If you start on 3 quavers, I'd want it on a back bow, and if you have a dotted note, it's usually forwards, because then the next quaver is a back bow. So in this case, to get that coming right in this second bar, first whole bar, you need to be starting on a back bow. So we reach the 4th note on a forward bow, ready for the scales. And it will stay right for a long time, and it'll go wrong at bar 44. On the next line down, the first bar, it will go wrong because there's not the right number of notes, basically. So you have to do one tuck somewhere. There's several possibilities. Let's not think about that for this moment. Can we play fairly slowly? Dee da 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 da, dee da 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 da, and so on. So coming after 4, I'm counting minims. It's a slightly strange entry, but in fact this is an extract there where you would have been playing beforehand. So be ready on a back bow for that D after the 4th minim beat. 2 and 3 and 4. There shouldn't be a B flat. I played one, but there isn't one in 45, if anyone noticed. We'll do that again. So the next thing here is that whenever we have the leaps, we don't want an accent on the first quaver of the group. Some of them might. I mean, some of the first quavers of a group may need a slight stress, but definitely not when it's the jump. Otherwise we get this. And that doesn't sound nice. And people tend to do that without realizing because of the difficulty of the leap. Getting ready to jump up 2 strings or 3 strings, they automatically put a little bit of an accent on that bottom note. So think of it as a diminuendo to the bottom note before the leap, every time. And then starting the top of the scale a little stronger probably than it was, depends whether the whole thing's going up or down. But we want to hear it cascading as if it's overlapping different people. And the other thing we want is for that bottom note that you're going to play very gently to carry on ringing while you cross the string to the next one. So whatever note is on that bottom note, it's got to stay there. and you've got to find another finger to play the next note, which is not that difficult in this case. There's usually plenty of fingers around. But the tendency is to let that bottom note finger jump off, and then you get a very short, accented, not very nice bottom note. Let's try it slightly slower. Let's just start from the fourth note, that dotted D on the forward bow. And we're going to go dee da 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 da, hold the finger, ba dee da da, and so on. Hold the finger on the bottom of each scale, if possible, and it's diminuendo. Start on that D. This is the fourth note of the line. After 1 and 1. Hold. Hold. So that should be a habit that you're already in, and some of you may be, but I'm sure that not everyone does it all the time. It's nice when they do, because the resonance overlaps with the top, and therefore it sounds like another voice coming in and not like a line with an awkward interval of a seventh or something like that, which is not really what it's about. It's all this overlapping stuff. Just check what else in there. Yeah, I already said we'll be looking at similar things which go upwards later. Just about this awkwardness of bar 44, the first bar of the second line, something needs to happen with the bow, and there's actually quite a lot of choices. What we need is to have, when you see the first group of 4 quavers on that second line, we need a back bow on the top quaver. That's the second quaver of the group. And rather than try and make a correction after 2 quavers across an octave leap or whatever, it's probably better to do it before. I think the easiest way is, if you've come from the previous line, you'll end up on a back bow there, on that long D. If you tuck in the next G, on another back bow, then you're ready to carry on. That gives you the most time. That's what I would generally choose. But it could be any other combination of tucking round there, because there are leaps and there are breaks in the phrase. You could choose to do it somewhere else. But the main thing is, by the time you get to the G, that is the first quaver, second quaver of the first group, definitely back bow there, because otherwise all the quavers come the wrong way. And then when you get to the bottom, I'd crescendo all the way down. Whoops, not like that. But go all the way through to the next note. And then you've got to hold that note for a whole bar, which is quite a long time, especially at this slow practice speed, but it's good practice. So let's do the second line. We'll start from the beginning of the second line now. We'll start, let's say, on a back bow, which is the way it would come if you haven't done something on the way, and then try it with 1 extra back bow on the next note. And we'll go back up to speed now. D, 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 da, up. It might be faster still, but that'll do for now. 3 and 4 and... And it's absolutely essential those last 2 notes are joined together, being the cadence again. And because they're such long notes, I would tend not to bar, even though it's all right to bar the first finger sometimes. It's a weaker sound. So I would probably put a different finger on the second note, just because we need quality sound. If something's going on for a whole bar, you don't want it to sound feeble or slightly out of tune. We'll leave that one. I'm going to pick up my treble, and we're going to go on to the next 2 examples, 3A and 3B, are both from the duets for 2 trebles. So we've talked briefly about 9 fantasies in 3 parts, and then he wrote 6 fantasies for 2 trebles. which are also published for 2 tenors by Hunter edition, and probably somewhere they're written for 2 basses, or if you're a bass player you could just play it from the treble clef. It would be just like playing the treble. And they really work on any size of R, but they are specifically for trebles, and they don't really use the bottom end of the range at all, probably because trebles don't really sound very good going low, and they're usually willing to go up to the odd top A, which they do here. Not in the first 2 examples. So we're looking at 3A now, and I think it's some of the best music really for 3-part music. I'm sorry, 2-part. They're some of the best duets of anybody's, I would say. This is the first one. It's probably the best known one. But what I would like to look at for this and the next bit is basically looking at the patterns in the music, which for George Hunter, if any of you got his edition, there are no bar lines in this edition, which is, I mean, it's useful in a way because it does tend to make you see the patterns better. But what I like to think is that if you can ignore the bar lines, you can still see the patterns. And the bar lines are just useful for shouting out numbers, or let's say go from this bar or that bar. So looking at this very first example, it's actually not the very opening because the first treble opens with the same thing but goes slightly different later. So the second treble is coming in on the first beat of what would be bar 2, but it's an upbeat. I mean, it may not look like an upbeat, but it needs to be, because then we've got patterns of 3 crotchets. If you don't count the first note, we've got minim, crotchet, minim, crotchet, minim, crotchet. Then we've got a slight hiccup with a dotted crotchet quaver, and then another minim, crotchet, minim. So basically this piece is in triple time. If you count crotchets, it's in 3/4, whatever you like to call the beats. So if we weren't playing the first note, I would be thinking, starting on the second note, I'm going to count 3 crotchets for nothing to try and get you in the mood of thinking that we're in triple time rather than duple time. Forget the first note for now. So it's going to go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Let's do that again. It may seem odd to some of you to be doing this, but if you think of a syncopation, it looks like a syncopation. You might say it is a syncopation. It will never sound, to me, that convincing. It won't sound like triple, and I think it should. So start again, still without the first note. 1, 2, 3. And if you're happy to think in a sort of subdivide, whatever you like to call it, thinking of crotchet beats, it doesn't really matter that in the middle of bar 3 there are suddenly only 2 crotchets. You've got dotted crotchet quaver, and then you've got another triple time. So I'm counting sort of subconsciously 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1. And that combination of 3 crotchets, and 2 crotchets is exactly what happens in a rumba. And there are lots of rumbas in early music, especially in Bird, but also in Gibbons. Not always the right order, maybe it's a tango in some cases, but that sort of swinging of the rhythm from what looks like straight 4 minims in a bar into groups of 3 and occasional 2s. Now let's put the first note in. So it's just a minim, as the others are, but it's an upbeat to the second minim. And I'm just going to count 4 minims for now, but think of it as an upbeat, even though I'm counting 4. These are the end of the previous bar where the other treble would be playing the same thing. 2, 3, 4. Do that once more. Definitely starting on a back bow because we want forward bow on all the minims as far as possible. And in this case it works out perfectly. 3, 4, upbeat. And that goes on for ages and ages. And actually, once you put the 2 parts together, if both people are doing that, it makes it really hard to come in. But it's fun. And going on to the next little bit, which is also from the same piece, If anyone has the Hunter edition, this is actually what he calls letter F. I decided not to count all the way through the unbarred piece to see what bar it might have been. But this is quite a long way on in the piece, and the two trebles are getting quite busy playing against each other. I think we should look at the lower line first. They're very similar, but starting on the lower line of these two lines of example 3B, we've got the three quavers starting on C. Let's just play it, but what you'll notice, or what I hope you'll notice, is that that pattern of forward bow on the dotted crotchet, back bow on the quaver goes on for the entire line, which means you're bound to run out of bow, which means that you're bound to snatch something or other to have enough bow to finish the line, but we'll see what happens. I'm going to count, what am I counting? Da 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 dum, da 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 da. So it's quite slow minims, but we're in quavers. So it's going to go 1. It's a silly way to count. I'll count crotchets. So it'll be 1, 2, da 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 da, 1, 2, da 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 da. So this is the lower line of those two, starting on a C. 1, 2. Did anyone run out of bow, I wonder? If you didn't, it probably means you were snatching on at least some of the quavers. But that's all right. It's bound to happen. We'll do that again. One thing, this happens also, this type of thing happens in some of the Purcell fantasies. It goes on and on and on with long, short, long, short, long, short. You are bound to run out. You have to find a way to look for places where you can recover slightly by taking a slightly more important quaver, one probably that leads upwards rather than downwards, and using more bow on that quaver, which helps you to crescendo into the top note. So for example, that first quaver we have on its own, this one can be relatively strong because you're going for the top G. But if you do it on a downward thing like this, they really jump out, which we don't want. So we'll go a little bit slower. It's actually, in some ways, you've got more time to think, but it needs more bow. Dee da da da, dee da. That speed. I'm counting 2 crotchets for nothing. 1, 2. And you may be thinking about bowing, but in fact a lot of those patterns again are 3 groups of 3 crotchets. D, da da da, D, da da da, D, da 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 da. So if you wanted to have fun with an unbarred version of this, I would just be dividing all the groups into, not only into 3s, possibly 5s or 2s, but just seeing the groups and not thinking about which beats of the bar they are. It makes such a difference to the piece. Let's do that. Let's do the upper line now. Same idea, except that it goes wrong once. There's one extra note, which means that it goes wrong towards the end of bar 2. And you could just play the end the other way around. It wouldn't really matter. But I would prefer to make one correction, which I would do on the dotted D crotchet, that is towards the end of bar 2, and another back bow on the bottom C quaver, because it's a place where the phrase doesn't really show too much if you make a tuck there. It's not incredibly audible moment, I would say. So let's try that. This is the top line now, after a 1. I'm going to go 3, 4, 1. I'm still counting crotchets. We go a little bit faster. 3, 4, 1. Tuck. And it goes on. mean, the whole piece is like this, really. Can imagine getting that together with the other treble, which we can't really do on Zoom very efficiently. But what we should be hearing is continuous quavers, because when you see it in score, you can see that they're all offset, but there will be continuous quaver movement, which shouldn't sound bumpy. It should sound like smooth, continuous quavers, getting the right balance between the two trebles. And that's something to try with a friend, I would say, because it's a really fabulous bit. And that's this whole of the first one is full of such typical Gibbons figures that it'll be really useful for lots of other pieces, I would say, looking at that. Let's move on to the one at the bottom of the page, exercise 4, which is another one of the 3-part pieces. This is Fantasia number 8, but it's the bottom of that first page. It's one of the treble 3-part pieces which has 2 trebles and 1 bass. I mentioned already that the style of these is a bit different, but one other thing to warn you, if you're a treble player, and if you're one of those treble players who volunteer to play second treble because you think it'll be easier, I wouldn't recommend it, because, well, this one we'll look at in a moment, but number 9, which follows it, the first treble has no semiquavers, usually starts off pretty fast and lively, not realizing that both the other treble, second treble, and the bass have lots and lots of semiquavers going bum 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 bum. So just be warned. Second treble in Gibbons is often harder than first treble. And for this one, I would say the same applies, because coming in on this at the beginning, which is treble 1, is pretty easy. You just got to play the notes, play them in time. But for the others, if you make a good job of this, it'll be really hard for them to come in, because these patterns are nothing to do with minim beats 4 and a bar. You can see that straight away. So we've got groups of 4 notes mainly. Well, not all of them, but that's already into triple time. If I was thinking before we start in 3 crotchets, we get 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, and so on. Can we do that all together? Let's try and go to the end of the first line at that speed, thinking in triple time and trying to make sure that we hear no bar line at all, no feeling of trying to stress that middle quaver, especially where there's a bar line, but not anyway. Da di da da ba. It's all rising phrase to the top, and if possible, we've already talked about this, string crossing is nice to get the nice harmonic resonance. I wouldn't do it on one string, it's nicer without. And holding the finger when you cross the string, because we want it to ring. That last quaver before the jump needs to carry on ringing, maybe an open string sometimes. Let's try that all together. I'm counting 3 for nothing, as if we're barred in 3/4. 1, 2, 3. Quite easy until you have to come in after 3 bars rest and you have no idea where the bar's gone for the other parts. I've heard it go wrong many times. Going on to the next line of this, similar. There's a little bit which is not triple, beginning of the second line, and then triple again. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I mean, there are triple groupings in all of these Elizabethan composers and later, but in these Gibbons there are so many of them. It's a really good way to get used to spotting them, and seeing the patterns makes such a difference. Let's try that second line. We won't do the join for now, but it doesn't. Again, the bow may go wrong. Doesn't really matter, because it's going to go right the next time. So don't worry now about the bowing. I'm starting this line on a forward bow just because it works out better later. After, I'm going to count minims now, just to put you all off. So back to minim counting, but it only lasts for 5 crotchets, and then we're into 3s again. 3 and 4 and 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. Very exciting music, I think. I'm going to move on because I don't want to miss out some of the later things. So going on to the next page, it's 4-part music to start with. And Gibbons only seemed to have written 3 pieces in 4 parts. That's all that survives anyway. So there are 2 big fantasies for what we call the great double bass, or probably we should say double bass, but it's always spelt with a double O at that point, and 1 very early in nomine. And this next number 5 that we're going to look at comes from the first of the 4-part fantasias. So the double bass, or the double bass, is just a large, extra large bass viol tuned from A to A instead of D to D. Could be tuned in G, but these pieces specifically only go down to A, never to G, as far as I know, and it seems to work fine in A. And some people don't like a B string, so they tune it to something else. But not many people have got a spare large bass viol to do that. So if you've got a 7-string viol, of course you can play them on that, even though the 7-string viol hadn't been invented by that stage. It's still, they're fun pieces to play. They're very different from the other ones, much later in style, lots of sections, time changes. I'm going to get my tenor. So this opening of number 1 is one of the probably longest tenor solos of the repertoire, starting with the tenor on its own for 2 bars. Doesn't sound like long, but it feels like a long time. And this theme it comes in every part. It comes 6 times in the first section, spread out between the 4 different parts. So I didn't say this, but the instrumentation for these pieces is a treble viol, a tenor viol, a bass viol, that is a normal bass viol, and then a large bass viol, the double bass, tuned down a 4th to get the extra low notes which come in that part. So fairly straightforward notes. Little bit of problem with the bowing, but just do whatever you feel like for now. It needs to feel quite dancey. Dum bum 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 ba dum bum ba, something like that speed. Counting minims, not in triple time anymore, just for a change. 3, 4. Quite straightforward, but not quite so easy when you're playing it on your own and nobody else comes in for 2 bars. Bowing wise, I would say I would want that long run of quavers, that's in mainly the 3rd bar, to come the right way. So something needs correcting in the first 2 bars to get that bottom quaver on a forward bow. What you could do is wait till that moment. So you do this as it comes, you get your top G on a forward bow, which feels lovely, but then you can't possibly get back to have enough bow for your quavers in a good place. And if you play your quavers down at the heel, they don't usually sound very nice. And that top G needs a lot of bow to sound nice, the dotted minim. So I would prefer to have that top G, the dotted minim in bar 2, on a back bow, which takes you to the right part of the bow, ready for the quavers. So the question is how to get that top G on a back bow. And basically you either tuck on the 3rd and 4th notes, now another forward bow, I find that the easiest. Or you could wait a bit longer, play it as it comes. Then another forward bow. It's okay, but the thing is, it's a little bit stilted sounding on those two crotchets. Whereas if you do it in the first bar, you've got a string crossing, which always resonates if you keep your fingers down. So you don't really hear that the bow is having to stop and carry on because you've got that string crossing resonance. And that only works if you hold your finger down. So that was the other thing to say. If we, not thinking of the bow direction now, but looking at the shape, this is the first bit of tune. Is going to that note. It's really as if that last C crotchet of the bar is just an upbeat to give emphasis, but it's actually the line is just going straight up to the F. So it's important to hold that finger on the E, and it's important to hold another finger on the C, so that rings as well, and that leaves you with two fingers you could choose from to play the F. I would put a 3 on it. I'm sure a lot of you are used to that sort of fingering, but it just makes such sense of the lines that you don't just hear a sort of zigzag line, you hear the line going up. Let's not talk about the rest of it because it's quite straightforward, but let's play the whole of that line again on whatever you've got in your hand. Some sort of correction to the bowing, trying to get those quavers going on a forward bow at the end of the second bar. 3, 4. Very nice. Going on, this is a completely different sort of thing. In these 4-part pieces, Gibbons uses directions for the first time, I think, only time. He uses words such as long, away, and soft. And I would say the only thing you could be certain of is that soft means soft, because those other two words are quite ambiguous. Long could mean it's slow, or it could mean use a long bow, or it could mean play very legato. Could mean any of those. Away almost certainly means something a little bit more lively, but still you don't really know if it's faster or more jumpy or more detached, whatever. So we haven't got away in this, but in fact we have, because the first 2 bars of this exercise 5B are marked away further back in the piece. So at this point in the piece, it's towards the end, there are lots of cascading scales going down fast, that sort of thing. And then suddenly, with no rest at all, you get to the next bar and it says long and soft. And you could say, well, long, that's there because you've got a long note instead of a short note. That might be the case, but it's definitely got to be soft. And he doesn't give anything like fairly soft or crescendo or decrescendo. You just have to do what you think. But I think these effects that he writes in usually imply a fairly sudden change. So what I'd like everyone to try is playing the first 2 bars pretty strong, pretty fast, and then going soft with no gap at all on that bar line between the G sharp and the A. So we're going into the long with no hiatus at all, and then playing incredibly soft for the last bar. The notes aren't that difficult, but it's just getting your mind to change from very energetic to being very gentle and very soft. Let's try that. I'm going to count in minutes, quite fast for the first bit. 3, 4, 1. So it's often needed to play suddenly something different. It might just be that you need to play one short note out of lots of long ones, something like that. But this is a good practice for changing your mood. One other thing to think about is that the bow speed gives a different, regardless of the speed at which you play the music. If you use a fast bow for something that's called away or that looks lively or needs to be lively, the fast bow is going to give much better effect of that energy than if you just play the notes fast with a slow bow. That is, I would use more bow, that is the bow's moving faster for each crotchet or whatever, to give the excitement of something that's really busy. And the main thing with not so much the soft but the long, is to go into a slow bow. So you've got to put the brakes on with no spare time, and then have a slow bow, fairly slow. And the best way to get soft is to come away from the bridge, if possible. But of course you can't jump away, miles from the bridge with no gap. But you can think about coming away from the bridge as soon as you've got to that note. So then the sound of the consort playing away from the bridge is just so beautiful, just to be used in special places. That's worth remembering, to come away from the bridge in that sort of place. Can we try that whole line now? Just the same again, but really trying to go so soft that you can hardly hear yourself. From the beginning of that line, lots of bow in these scales. 3, 4, 1. And so on. One thing I failed to say is that there's some more 3-part music, which not that many people know about, which is another 4 fantasias which need the great double bass, or a 7-string bass. They're for, by Gibbons this is, they're treble, ordinary bass, consort bass you might call it, and big bass. And again, they go down to low A's quite often. And there's 1 galliard as well in that collection. And then there are 3 more fantasias in that same style with the same range, which George Hunter attributes, or used to attribute, to Coprario. But I notice in one of the other editions he doesn't mention Coprario. He mentions 8 fantasias for the double bass. So he may have changed his mind at some point. But the interesting thing with the Coprario ones, if they are Coprario, is that one of the themes that Gibbons uses in the first set, in his set, is they're exactly the same but inverted by Coprario or whoever it is. So who knows who wrote those? But they are all exciting pieces, very much in the style of the 4-part, so quite late with lots of sections, time changes, and quite a lot of high notes for the treble and extra low notes for the bass. So they might be worth looking for. They're also published. All of this Gibbons, the entire Gibbons instrumental music, is published by George Hunter. Moving fairly swiftly onwards, Fantasia 1. No, sorry, I'm way behind. Moving on to 5-part music. This is exercise extract 6 we're on to now. We only had 3 pieces in 4 parts, and there seem to be only 4 pieces in 5 parts. So 5-part music and 3 and 4-part is fairly small number of pieces by Gibbons. So in the 5-part music of the Hunter edition, there are 3 in nominees, all very good pieces, and we're going to look at those now, and a pavan. But the pavan in his version, in his edition, is a reconstruction from a keyboard source. But there is one other pavan which he didn't include, which is published actually by our Gamba Society. It's the Pavan de la Roy, or Roi, the king, but it's incomplete in the source. There are 2 parts out of 5 missing, which is quite a lot. But actually there have been 3 modern reconstructions of that piece, including the one published by the Gamba Society. And it's quite an early work. It seems it's one of his earliest pieces. It would be quite interesting sometime to compare the 3 versions of that Pavan de la Roy with reconstructed parts, or maybe somebody will like to reconstruct their own part, see what they can do with that. So that's the total sum of the 5-part music. What we're going to look at here is 2 bits of in nominees, well 3 bits actually. So number 6 is the in nominee number 1. The opening's actually on the treble, but I'm just staying on the tenor for the moment. But the first in nominee of the 3 is really much the earliest in style, absolutely stunningly beautiful, I think, and incredibly calm. and what it needs is to have this opening theme played without any bumps. And it may look fairly easy, but there are quite a lot of rather long notes followed by short notes, which is always going to be a problem. So let's play that line, extract number 6. After the crotchet rest is the opening of the piece. The crotchet rest will be the nomine starting, followed by what would be a treble viol coming in. Something like that, very dreamy, very legato. You can see, well, you can guess that you're going to run out of bow if you keep it smooth, but we'll see. So start fairly near the tip on a back bow, so your first dotted crotchet is coming forwards, and we'll see what happens to the bow as we go through that first line. I'm counting minims and come in after the 1. 3 and 4 and 1. Did anyone run out of bow? Possibly not, because very kindly he's put in a couple of long notes that come out in the other direction if you let them. I mean, some people are so keen to tuck everywhere to get the bow going the right way, you know, always like that, and then it goes wrong one note later. It's better not to let it, just ignore it. So in this case, we get to bar 2. Now we've got a semi-breve on a back bow. So you might like to use the whole bow on that. Looks like it. But if you do, then you've got to have... which we don't want. We don't want a lot of bow on that crotchet after the semi-breve. But then you've got another long note, the dotted crotchet, relatively long, on a back bow. And that should have taken you back to the tip, and then for that last bar, bar 3, you're ready right near the tip again to play. So it works out perfectly. I mean, it's pretty rare that stuff like this works out as well as this does, but one doesn't necessarily see that it's going to work out, and you still get those sort of panicky feelings of getting the crotchet too big. Can we try that all together? Try and imagine your bow travelling at this constant speed. I mean, that's only a starting point, because obviously we don't want everything to sound the same. But it's the calmness, the way the bow moves without being in a rush, that's going to help the mood of this piece, I would say, especially for this opening. And the other parts get very similar things to this as well. The nomine, of course, is doing mainly one note to a bar. Once more from the beginning, after 1. 4 and 1. It's probably Gibbons' calmest piece in the whole repertoire, I would say. That opening doesn't stay there. Well, it does stay pretty calm for the whole piece. Moving on to 7A, this is definitely not a calm piece. Well, it starts off that way. This is some of you may know this, the syncopated one, number 2 out of the 3 in nominees. Extremely risky in its opening bars, getting everyone is across the beat except for the nomine, and even the nomine usually has trouble coming in at the right place because the beat has totally disappeared. But this is much later on in that piece, and I chose it because it's the reverse of the pattern we had in extract number 2, where we had all the scales falling down and jumping up. Now we've got all the scales running up and jumping down. So it's almost like a mirror image or a reverse of what we did earlier. Slightly harder in a way, because we've got, looking at the first 4 notes, this is exercise 7A, and then I'm making huge breaks on purpose. But the problem is, if you crescendo to the top, which one wants to do musically, that doesn't sound nice, because the top note is the end of the phrase. In every case, the highest note you reach is the end of that little bit of phrase, followed by another phrase coming in lower down. So what we need to do is to crescendo towards it, but then just slightly give up on it. Not so much that it's not there, but just less than you might expect, I would say. And the other thing you need to do is to cross the string very quickly to be ready for the next note. But if you take your finger off, you get this horrible stopping of the sound and an accent as well. So the finger has to stay on the top note. Let's do it very slowly. Let's do it together. Da dee da 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 da. In every case, hold the finger on the top note or play an open string. But whenever you play an open string, it sometimes means one more string to cross, which might be harder, possibly. You can choose. That speed, so that's really quite slow. Those are minims. Are they minims? Dun, 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 dun. I'm going to count 4 before we start anyway. 3 and 4 and 1. Do that once more and I'll play an E natural this time, which I should have done already. 3 and 4 and 1. Now it's going to be much faster than that. But in order to get good at doing this and keeping your finger down and crossing the bow ready to play, it needs incredibly slow practice, I think, to get a really, really clean sound and to get the phrasing to not feel like a mad dash to get across there, but just to let the bow fall down a string or 2 strings or whatever. Let's try going on bar 46. Similar thing, but here on the way up we've got, and then no jump, but still a new phrase. So we don't want to hear a continuation. Definitely not. It's 4 quavers and then 4 more quavers and then another jump and then another jump. So again, every one of those final notes is slightly weak, just slightly, so that it doesn't sound like an accent on the top notes. Let's try from 46. There's one correction needed on bar 47 if you happen to remember. If you do 2 back bows on the first 2 quavers, it'll come out right for the end. Doesn't matter if you don't want to do that, but that's where I would do it because it's the break in the phrase. And making a tuck between 2 phrases is the best place to choose because it doesn't sound like a gap that you don't want. It's a gap that you do want, in effect. Gap's too strong a word. It's hardly anything, but it's a tiny thing. Let's do the whole line. That slow speed, I think. 4 and 1. That's so typical Gibbons. I mean, both these things with the scales. I mean, we could easily spend the whole session on one piece because there will be so many things to look at. But let's move on. I'm moving on to the treble as well to look at. This is the same in nominate, number 2, the one that starts very syncopated. The end is one of the hardest things Gibbons ever wrote, I would say, because it has to go fast. We probably won't do it fast right now, but it's just really exciting, but technically I would say quite hard. So this is 7B, and I decided to move on to the treble because I need it for the last 2 pieces as well. the question is how to make these semiquavers sound clear. I mean, you've got 5-part texture. Everyone's doing it, not usually overlapping, not all at the same time, because in between there are some slower notes. Even the nominee gets 1 bar of this pattern. So you might think you'll play the nominee, but if you don't keep, you know, really awake, you might miss your 1 bar of semiquavers, which would be a shame. Forget the first 3 notes for the moment. We're just looking at this pattern without any notes. If we just play it on we'll play it on an A. I'm doing very slowly now. That's basically quaver 2 semiquavers. It will be a lot faster. But the problem is if you don't release the sound on the quaver, it starts to sound very heavy-handed and sluggish. A bit like that. And you just don't hear the rhythm coming through the texture. So I would say that what you have to do, even though it will be fast, is fade the first quaver of every group, then put the pressure on the bow, and then play the semiquavers joined into the next quaver, and then release the sound on the quaver, and then next 2 semiquavers joining into the quaver. So the quaver is the strong beat, but, I mean relatively strong, it has to fade to sound good. If I just play a tiny bit without fading, wrong key again, but never mind, it sounds quite hard work. It is hard work anyway, but if I lighten that quaver a little bit, that's what we're aiming for, I would say, and a crescendo, of course. Let's do it all together slowly, a bit slowly, from bar 51. So forget the first 3 notes, start on a forward bow, for now anyway. It's going to reverse whatever you do, so it's not desperately important. And we're going to go fading this speed, fade, 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 and so on. Do that together. So these are very slow crotchets. Dum, no, they're quavers. 7, 8. Possible at that speed. Quite hard if we go faster, but we'll try it faster now. I start forwards, well, I like to anyway, if I remember, because it's nice to arrive, I think, on the top on a forward bow. You could do it either way, but it just feels a little bit more like a very positive arrival on your high note, which is usually a minim. And this happens in all the parts overlapping. The 3 notes before we start are all upbeats to that phrase. Dum, 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 bum, ba-da-dum, 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 ba-da-dum. Let's try that speed now. Still quite fast. You may not be able to do the fade at that speed, but it's something to practice for later. So start on a back bow. I'm counting crotchets, and it's the last 3 crotchets of the bar. So, what's it? 5, 3, 4, 5. Come in after 5. 3, 4, 5. One, 2. And so it goes on for bars and bars. I find that it's really one of the hardest things in all of Gibbons' repertoire, not counting some of the 6-part stuff I'm just about to do now. So the last 2 pieces, I know we're slightly running out of time. I hope people can just stay another 5 minutes or so. But just briefly about the 6-part music, there are, just to complete the sort of overview, there are 6 well-known fantasias published by Faber's as well as Hunter, and they've been known for years because of that publication. There are also 3 more published by PRB, 3 more probably Gibbons, which are in a slightly different style. We saw them in the manuscript at Oxford as well, those of us that were there. and they sound a little more vocal, but they still sound like Gibbons. And then there's Pavan and Galliard, rather strange because the Pavan sounds like a Galliard and the Galliard sounds more like a Pavan. And then a big set of variations on Go From My Window, 10 variations on that very famous tune, of which one variation is completely basses going mad, playing semiquavers quite a lot faster than the ones we just played here. And so it doesn't often get played, but it's a very good piece. So it's a bit of a shame. Definitely recommend trying it if you haven't played that piece. The last two pieces we're going to look at, both from the 6-part repertoire. So number 3 is the one that people often call the squeeze box, full of dissonances at the beginning. This is much more towards the end. So a lot of the Gibbons 6-part are easy to understand, I would say, in the first half of the piece. And then he breaks into little fragments and makes it slightly hard to know what to do with them, or to see even what the fragments are. And I think for this one, it's particularly sort of obscure what's going on. But what you can see here in this example, if we look towards the end of it, you can see little groups which have a minim followed by 2 quavers falling. So it's a falling phrase, long note. This is like the 3 notes before 50. And then you get later on the same. And then. And I think that's definitely a very important little theme. It's very short, but you need to bring it out through the texture. And nearly all the parts get some of that. Some get hardly any and some get quite a lot. But that's something to look for in the second half of this piece. And the other thing in the second half is these upward rising 4-note scales. Most of the scales are in crotchets going just normal, all over the place. You're going to get 4 notes rising scales. But these ones, the further you go into the piece, the more you get a quaver upbeat. So instead of having just a smooth, you get this. And he keeps on doing it. Quaver upbeats instead of crotchets give a more feeling of urgency and just make it more exciting. And these quavers, I think, should come through the texture a bit. Because most people think, well, quaver, not important, play a little tiny bow, and then you don't even notice it's there. There's 5 other people playing. So I would say you need to bring out the quaver, not by lots of bow, but by plenty of pressure. On its own, it sounds far too much, but in the context of the piece, it would probably be just audible, or possibly still not audible, and is there. I mean, he needn't have written the quaver, he could have just had the crotchet. So I think it's quite important to bring those out. And then we'll play it all together now, starting at the beginning. After 3 is where you'd be coming in if I'm counting minims. I would start on a forward bow, even though that might feel a little odd for a quaver upbeat. It's actually a scale of crotchets with a shortened first note. And grip the string before you play, so we don't get a sort of whistly sound. You get that after 3. So 2 and 3. 1, 1. And then you get this opposite. There's both things going on at the same time in different parts. But it's just nice to have those 2 fragments to latch onto in the last part of this piece, so that you can see what you can do with those. And the other slight question, ambiguous question, is you could say that after we've had these high notes going, it goes. You could say those pairs of quavers are actually also quaver upbeats into the next dotted crotchet. But we probably don't want those to jump out because it's such a different sort of feeling there. It's really rather falling away, and the other people are coming up their scales with the bouncy quavers. Let's do it one more time and then we'll go on to our last example. After 3, 2 and 3. So that takes us on to our last example, and I want to just mention instrumentation in the Gibbons six part because so many people don't take any notice of it. But the numbers 1 to 4 are, as you would expect, the normal you might call it the standard lineup for 6 viols, 2 trebles, 2 tenors, and 2 basses. But number 5 and 6, the last 2 in the group, are completely different ranges, and what they need is 2 trebles again, an alto part, which could be played on an alto for those that have an alto, or a tenor viol playing high. Then 2 equal tenor parts, that's line 4 and 5 are equal tenors, and 1 bass. And if you play line 5 on a bass, which most people do, because that's the lineup they've got, it just doesn't match at all with the other tenor, because they're completely equal parts. So it's a totally different texture from the earlier ones. And if you think about the English madrigals in 6 parts, Wilby, Ward, all of those people, they are all for 2 sopranos, alto, 2 tenors and bass. It's completely standard lineup for the vocal aspect of this music, but not so common for the viols. Copperara uses it well in 6 parts, having an alto part. So it doesn't affect what we do now, but just bear in mind if you do those last 2, I would always recommend doing them with 1 bass and extra tenor. Now, just going on from the rather vulgar, perhaps, upbeats that we just did in the other piece, this one needs them as well. This is the very end of the 6th, the final fantasia. At this point in the piece, you get very strong upbeats coming in 1 crotchet apart on bar 45, where we're going to start. So these upbeats, I would say, need to be very firm and detached from the note that follows. Let's try it. So it happens for the first 4 bars or so, then it smooths out a bit. Then it can be just slightly less firm, and then we'll stop and I'll talk about the last line. After 1, 4 and 1. So you can feel, I mean, it doesn't have to, but I think it needs to calm down in those last 3 bars a little bit. It's still a jumping upbeat, still needs to be detached a little bit, but not quite so much as it was, especially when everyone's 1 crotchet apart fighting each other. It becomes calmer. And then when we get to the last line, you can see the lines going down there's now no rests in there at all. Once you get started, it's a continuous line going down and down and down with dotted notes. I think they need to be quite calm. So even though you now have an upbeat, I wouldn't want to then go, which is what usually happens anyway because you're trying to get enough bow, but I would try and play it incredibly smoothly on those dotted notes. Let's try that last line. So a slightly short upbeat, but calming, getting less and less and more legato all the way through to the end. After 1, 4 and 1. So you're likely to run out of bow, but there are places to help you, like we talked about earlier, when you've got an important crotchet rising, like, for example, just before the end of 52, you can do more bow on that one to get yourself back, and in bar 54, you get a dotted minim on a back bow, you can use that to get yourself back. So there are usually 1 or 2 places that help you not to run out of bow. I'd be nice just to play that last example all the way through, both lines of it continuously, calming yourself down for the end of the evening and getting softer and softer for the last note of the last Gibbons 6-part fantasy of the group. So starting with lots and lots of energy. 3 and 4 and 1. Bedtime. Not quite, but sorry to run on a bit. I don't know if there are any urgent questions. Hopefully not, but I forgot to mention that. I guess if you've got a really urgent question, you can send me an email.
Could I, on everyone's behalf, say thank you, Alison?
Yes, we all want to say thank you.
Interesting thing. So if you can unmute yourselves, you can give her a round of applause.
Don't know how to unmute.
And could I also thank Jonathan for volunteering to host this meeting?
Thank you very much.
As you may know, the Gamba Society is on the lookout for someone to oversee our meetings in the future. Francis, who's been doing it for the last year, has had to stop. And it may be that we ask for volunteers such as Jonathan to host individual meetings, as well as have someone that can oversee the program. So if you might be interested in hosting a program, or even more, if you've got things that you'd like to suggest as subjects for future meetings, we'd be very happy to hear from you. So thank you for that. Could I just do one quick little bit of advertising? As it happens, many of the pieces that Alison's chosen to take as examples will be featuring in the Rose Consorts programme at Benslow on the 20th of June, 7:30 in the evening. So those of you within reach of Benslow, you'd be very welcome to come to the concert, which is mostly music by Orlando Gibbons, but also by some of his brothers and other people that he worked with and knew. So it's sort of Gibbons in context. But it's interesting that Alison's chosen pieces that are obviously some of the ones that everyone enjoys playing, and I've decided to put in the programme. So I hope to see some of you there. At which point, I think we should say thank you to Alison and Jonathan and bid you all good night. Thank you very much.